Fear's sneaky, right? It can show up in the most simplest of ways, and it shows up in things like control. It shows up in overreactivity. It shows up in minimizing ourselves to please others. It shows up in particularly it can show up as tension in our bodies. It can show up as tension in our jaw. Do we have our tongue on the roof of our mouth? What are you holding in your shoulders? It shows up as urgency and frequency with bladder problems. It shows up as stomach pains, headaches. And in children in particular, it can be much more of a physical thing that you would notice. So in children, it can quite often be bedwetting, disturbed sleep, nightmares, consistent wetting throughout the day, hyperactivity. Any child that has been in fight or flight for a prolonged period of time can quite often be presenting with symptoms of hyperactivity because a child does not know what to do with this fear, and it puts their nervous system on high alert. And it also shows up, particularly with children, as control. Fear shows up? Where can they control things? When they feel out of control, when they feel not safe, what is it that they look to control? Bedtimes, food, sleep, getting out the door, all of those things. In fact, that's what we do a lot of in my paid program in the Tiger's Time Challenge, is looking at all those controlled areas and changing them. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the fact that these things are really, they're symptoms. And it's your subconscious talking to you. When you get into like overthinking and the negative chatter kicks in, what happens is actually what's happening in your brain is your brainwave states is completely changing. So our normal resting is in alpha. So our normal brainwave state as a resting adult is normally in alpha, and that's when we are sort of calm and relaxed and watching. However, when we get into anxious and overthinking and busy and distracted, our brainwaves speed up quite significantly and they go into beta. Now, this is really important to understand because actually when you understand how the brainwaves work, particularly with our children are naturally in what's called a theta brainwave state, which is a much slower brainwave state. And they're normally in that brainwave state between the ages of 2 and 7. And it's a little bit like a hypnotic trance. And it's where we have the most impact with our suggestions and everything else, but it's where they're forming their model of the world, which is why I'm so passionate about the work that I do. However, when we start overthinking, we go into a much faster brainwave state. And when that happens, it's actually our ability to slow this electromagnetic frequency down that brings balance to the body, which is why things like mindfulness, it's why things like conscious breathing all have an effect on the body, because it starts to slow down that brainwave state and the electromagnetic frequency that we're giving off. Now, I wanted to read you something today from this book here. So this is a book called The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. And I wanted to read this story to you today because it's a couple of pages. And he talks about the relationship between grace and mental illness. So I will read it for you. Mainly reading it because I won't remember all the names. It's about a Greek mythology. So this is a story about the great Greek myth of Orestes and Furies. Now, Orestes was a grandson of Atreus, a man who had viciously attempted to prove himself more powerful than the gods. Because of his crime against them, the gods punished Atreus by placing a curse upon all of his descendants. And as part of this enactment of this curse upon the house of Atreus, Orestes' mother murdered both his father and her husband. Now, this crime then in turn brought down the curse upon Orestes' head because, by the Greek code of honor, a son was obliged, above all else, to slay his father's murderer. Yet the greatest sin a Greek could commit was the sin of matricide, of killing his own mother. Now, Orestes agonized over his dilemma, and finally he did what he seemingly had to do and killed his mother. Traumatic, isn't it? For this sin, the gods then punished Orestes by visiting upon him the Furies. Now, you may have heard of the Furies. The Furies were 3 ghastly harpies who could be seen and heard only by him. and who tormented him night and day with their cackling criticism and frightening appearance. Pursued wherever he went by the Furies, Orestes wandered about the land seeking to atone for his crime. After many years of lonely reflection and self-abrogation, Orestes requested the gods to relieve him of the curse on the house of Atreus and his visitations through the Furies, stating his belief that he had succeeded in atoning for the murder of his mother. And finally, a trial was held by the gods. And speaking in Orestes' defense, Apollo argued that he had engineered the whole situation that had placed Orestes in the position in which he had no choice but to kill his mother. And therefore, Orestes could really not be held responsible. And this was the turning point for Orestes, because at this point, he jumped up and he contradicted his own defender, Apollo. And he said, "It was I, not Apollo, that murdered my mother." And the gods were amazed, because never before had a member of the house of Atreus assumed such total responsibility for himself and not blamed the gods. And eventually they decided in the trial to not only remove him of the curse, but also they transformed the Furies into the Emunides, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, loving spirits who through their wise counsel enabled Orestes to obtain continuing good fortune. Now, in this myth, it's not really that obscure, because what's really interesting is you can see in the myth that much of the torment has actually been passed down through family, through grandparents, through parents. And we know that 1 in 3 mental health issues begin in early childhood. We know that through conscious parenting, through the work that we do with shadow work and trauma, we know that the way that we have been brought up in those first 7 years of life has a huge impact on how we see, think, and feel about ourselves and the world around us. But what's really interesting, good morning, Sharon, my beautiful friend. What's really interesting for me is the way that when Orestes took complete responsibility for himself and decided to do the work to atone, he was able not only to get rid of the Furies, but they turned into the loving self-talk. And it's this transformation, this is the personal transformation, which has been the ongoing work that I do both with myself and my clients and the work in Raise a Tiger and Fear to Fierce. And it's that transformation work. But it starts ultimately with the acceptance and taking the responsibility that we are where we are because of every choice that we've ever made in our life, which can sometimes be quite difficult. But also understanding that these things, anxiety, panic attacks, racing thoughts, they're there to tell us that something's wrong. Now, I really want to talk to you a little bit about the, Brené Brown describes it beautifully, so I'm going to use her analogy. She talks about a turtle without a shell in a briar patch. And I invite you to think that throughout your life, you have been slowly building yourself a shell. And this is the ego, right? This is what we do. We construct a full sense of self or ego in order to be accepted by others. And of course, this means that we are quite often minimizing ourselves or hiding true parts of ourselves. And the work of transformation that I'm doing is about removing the shell and becoming much more an authentic, wholehearted human being. Because when we have this shell, it means that we can cope with life. But of course, what happens is when we start to take responsibility and we start to do the work, we start removing the outer shell. And when we start removing the outer shell, what happens is you will find that you will then be looking for more numbing things, because we all have numbing behaviors. And I've talked about this in a lot of my lives before. Alcohol, work. I can use work for numbing, scrolling on the internet, shopping. Some people use gambling, some people use sex, some people use all kinds of things as numbing behaviors, as distractions from the present moment so that to make life more manageable. And I always think that there's 2 processes to this process of transformation. The first one is the removal of the shell. It's the dismantling of the ego, and it's the undoing. And it's like a knot, isn't it? I had this conversation with one of my clients today. It's a little bit like a knot. You know, when you have one of those little knots in your jewelry box with a necklace, you will find you'll undo this bit over here, and then you reach a point where you can't undo that bit anymore. and you have to move over here, and then you have to loosen that bit there, and then that might loosen that bit over there. And we find that we work through things in layers. Sometimes things can come up that we think we've dealt with, but actually we just had to go and deal with something else first, and then that might rear its head again. There's the old analogy, isn't there, that like you walk down the road and you fall in the hole, and then you keep falling in the hole until you remember that the hole is there, and then you go around the hole, and then you walk on a little bit further and you will fall down the next hole. And it's a little bit like that. But the problem is that when you are undoing all of the things and you start working and removing the numbing behaviors and removing the things, the next part of the process that needs to happen is you need to get out of the briar patch. So many times we are not seeing these symptoms of anxiety and these problems of panic attacks and hyperactivity and tension. We're seeing them that maybe we need to have a drink to cope with it, or we need to do yoga to cope with it, or whatever it is that you do in order to cope, whether it's a healthy or an unhealthy. When actually, ultimately, what we need to be doing is looking at the environment, looking at what's causing the stress in the first place, and removing it from our lives so that we can live without the shell. The goal is to live without the shell.